In the year 2387, humanity had conquered the stars, built impossible cities that floated between dimensions, and created technology that could bend reality itself. We had mastered faster-than-light travel, terraformed dead worlds, and even learned to communicate with crystalline beings made of pure thought. But none of that prepared us for the day an alien refugee crash-landed in suburban Ohio and asked if she could crash on someone's couch. The Galactic Council had deemed humans impossibly chaotic and dangerously unpredictable. Other species followed strict behavioral protocols, ancient traditions, and logical social hierarchies that had governed their civilizations for millennia. They built societies on rigid rules, careful planning, and predictable outcomes. Humans. We built societies on pizza delivery at 3 a.m., the right to argue with traffic lights, and the sacred tradition of adopting any creature that looked even slightly sad. When Kira, a fox-eared alien from the distant Vulpine Empire, found herself stranded on Earth after her diplomatic transport was destroyed by space pirates, she expected to deal with the barbaric, rule-obsessed primitives her government had warned her about. What she found instead was Jake Morrison, a 28-year-old IT specialist who responded to finding an injured alien girl in his backyard by immediately offering her soup and asking if she needed to call someone. This is the story of how humanity's complete inability to follow anyone else's rules, including our own, accidentally saved the galaxy. Again, because while other species spent centuries debating the proper protocols for first contact, humans were too busy figuring out how to split the rent. Jake Morrison had always prided himself on being the kind of guy who minded his own business. In his 28 years of existence, he had perfected the art of getting through life with minimal drama. He went to work, came home, played video games, ordered takeout, and occasionally remembered to water the single dying plant his ex-girlfriend had left behind 6 months ago. It was a simple life, and he liked it that way. So when he stepped out onto his back porch on a Tuesday evening to take out the garbage and found what appeared to be a young woman with fox ears lying unconscious in his tomato garden, his first thought wasn't about alien invasion or government conspiracies or the fact that his entire worldview was about to be turned upside down. His first thought was, great, now I'm going to have to explain to Mrs. Henderson next door why there's someone passed out in my yard again. The fox-eared girl was small, maybe 5'2", with silver hair that caught the dying sunlight like spun metal. She wore what looked like a form-fitting bodysuit that shimmered with colors that shouldn't exist, and her fox-like ears twitched occasionally even though she appeared to be unconscious. Most troubling of all, there was a growing puddle of something that definitely wasn't blood pooling beneath her left shoulder. It was blue, and it sparkled. Jake stood there for a long moment, garbage bag in hand, trying to process what he was seeing. The rational part of his brain insisted that this was probably some elaborate prank. Maybe his coworker Dave had finally decided to get him back for that time Jake had filled his cubicle with packing peanuts. Dave was definitely weird enough to hire a cosplayer and stage an elaborate alien encounter. But the girl's breathing was shallow and labored, and that blue sparkly stuff was definitely coming from what looked like a genuine injury. Even Dave wasn't committed enough to actual bodily harm for a prank. Okay, Jake said to himself, setting down the garbage bag. Okay, this is happening. This is definitely happening, and I'm definitely not going to pretend I didn't see it and go back inside to order pizza like a normal person would. He pulled out his phone and started to dial 911, then stopped. How exactly did you explain to an emergency dispatcher that there was an injured alien girl in your backyard? Hi. Yeah. I'd like to report a medical emergency. No, she's not human. Fox ears. Yes, I said fox ears. No, I haven't been drinking. That conversation would go well. Instead, Jake did what any reasonable person would do in this situation, which was to assume that this was now his problem and figure out how to handle it himself. He knelt down beside the girl and gently touched her shoulder, careful to avoid the injury. Hey, he said softly. Hey, can you hear me? The fox ears twitched, and slowly, the girl's eyes fluttered open. They were a startling shade of amber, with pupils that were definitely not human. When she saw Jake leaning over her, she tried to scramble backward, but the movement must have aggravated her injury because she immediately cried out in pain. Whoa. Hey, it's okay, Jake said, holding up his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of non-aggression. I'm not going to hurt you. You're hurt, and you're in my backyard, and I'm trying to help." The girl stared at him for a long moment, her amber eyes wide with what looked like a mixture of fear and confusion. When she spoke, her voice was soft and melodic, but the words that came out were definitely not English. They sounded vaguely musical, like someone singing in a language made entirely of wind chimes. "Right," Jake said. "Language barrier. Of course there's a language barrier." He pointed to himself. "Jake," he said slowly. "I'm Jake." The girl tilted her head, fox ears perking up with interest. She seemed to understand the gesture, because she placed a hand on her own chest and said something that sounded like Kira. At least, that's what Jake thought she said. It could have been Kira, or possibly something completely different, but Kira seemed close enough. "Kira," Jake repeated, and the girl's eyes brightened slightly. "Oh, okay, Kira. Nice to meet you. Now let's see about that injury." Kira seemed to understand his intent because she shifted slightly to give him a better view of her injured shoulder. The wound was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. It looked like someone had taken a bite out of her shoulder with teeth made of lightning, leaving behind a crackling, sparkling mess that definitely shouldn't exist according to any medical textbook Jake had ever not read. "What the hell did this to you?" Jake muttered, then looked up to find Kira watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Sorry, that was probably insensitive. I'm sure whatever it was very—" He gestured vaguely. "Alien and terrifying." To his surprise, Kira made a sound that might have been a laugh, or possibly a sneeze. It was hard to tell. Jake stood up and brushed off his knees. "Okay, here's the thing. I have absolutely no idea how to treat whatever this is, but I do have a pretty well-stocked first aid kit and some general knowledge about not letting people bleed to death in my backyard. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to help you inside. We're going to get you cleaned up and bandaged, and then we're going to figure out what to do next. Does that sound reasonable?" Kira stared at him for a moment, then said something in her wind chime language that sounded like a question. "I have no idea what you just asked," Jake said cheerfully. "But I'm going to assume it was, yes, Jake, that sounds like a perfectly reasonable plan, and thank you for not immediately calling the government or running away screaming." He held out his hand to help her up. Kira looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, as if she were trying to solve a complex puzzle. Finally, she reached out and took it. Her hand was smaller than his, and warmer than he'd expected, and when her skin made contact, Jake felt a strange tingling sensation, like a mild electric shock. Kira's eyes widened, and she said something sharp and surprised in her own language. "Yeah, I felt that too," Jake said, helping her to her feet. She was unsteady, leaning heavily on his arm, but she managed to stand. Probably some kind of alien thing. We'll add it to the list of stuff to figure out later. Getting Kira inside turned out to be more complicated than Jake had anticipated. Not because she was particularly heavy or difficult to maneuver, but because she seemed genuinely amazed by everything she saw. She stopped to stare at his back door like it was the most fascinating thing she'd ever encountered, running her fingers along the frame and muttering to herself in her musical language. When he opened it for her, she actually jumped back in surprise. "It's just a door," Jake said, then immediately felt stupid for trying to explain doors to someone who had presumably traveled across space to get here. "Although I guess your doors might work differently. Do you have doors?" "That's probably a weird question." Kira stepped through the doorway with the cautious air of someone entering a potential trap. Once inside, she immediately began examining everything within reach. She poked at his light switches, stared in fascination at his refrigerator, and spent a solid 30 seconds trying to figure out how his kitchen faucet worked. "Okay, clearly we come from very different technological backgrounds," Jake said, watching her turn the faucet on and off repeatedly with an expression of pure wonder. "But we really should take care of that injury first. Medical attention, then cultural exchange." He guided her to his living room and settled her on the couch, then went to retrieve his first aid kit from the bathroom. When he returned, he found Kira examining his television remote like it was a religious artifact. "How do you even travel through space if you don't know what a remote control is?" Jake asked, sitting down beside her. "Actually, never mind. That's probably another question for later. Let me see that shoulder." Kira seemed to understand his intent because she carefully maneuvered her injured arm so he could get a better look at the wound. Up close, it was even more bizarre than it had appeared in his backyard. The edges of the wound seemed to shift and sparkle, and occasionally little arcs of blue electricity would dance across the surface. "This is definitely beyond my pay grade," Jake muttered, opening his first aid kit. "But let's see what we can do." He started by carefully cleaning the wound with antiseptic wipes. To his surprise, the blue sparkly stuff seemed to respond well to the antiseptic, gradually fading from electric blue to a more subdued silver color. Kira winced during the process, but she held still and didn't complain. "You're tougher than you look," Jake said, applying antibiotic ointment to the injury. "Whatever attacked you, it did a real number on your shoulder, but it's not as bad as I thought. I think I'm not really qualified to diagnose alien injuries." As he worked, Jake found himself stealing glances at Kira's face. Now that she wasn't unconscious or in obvious pain, he could see that she was actually quite pretty in an otherworldly sort of way. Her features were delicate and symmetrical, with high cheekbones and a small, pointed chin. Her silver hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and those fox ears were actually kind of adorable, the way they swiveled to track sounds around the room. "So," Jake said as he carefully wrapped her shoulder with gauze, "I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess that you're not from around here. Like, not from Earth. Am I right?" Kira watched him work for a moment, then pointed to herself and said something in her musical language. Then she pointed upward and made a gesture that might have been meant to indicate space or the sky, or possibly just the ceiling fan. "Right, space," Jake said. "I figured as much." The fox ears were kind of a giveaway. We don't really have fox people on Earth. We have regular foxes, and we have people, but no fox people. He finished bandaging her shoulder and sat back to examine his work. It wasn't professional quality medical care, but it would do until they could figure out something better. "There," he said. "That should hold you for a while. How does it feel?" Kira moved her arm experimentally, testing the range of motion. She seemed pleased with the result, because she smiled for the first time since he'd found her. It was a genuinely warm smile, and it made her whole face light up. Then she did something that caught Jake completely off guard. She placed her hand over her heart and said something in her musical language that sounded formal and important. Then she reached out and touched his hand, repeating the same phrase. "I have no idea what you just said," Jake admitted, "but you're welcome. I think." "Was that thank you?" Kira nodded enthusiastically, then pointed to herself and said Kira again. Then she pointed to him and attempted to say his name. It came out as something like Jaka, which was close enough. "That's right," Jake said. "Jake, and you're Kira. Now that we got the introductions out of the way, we should probably figure out what happens next." He leaned back on the couch and ran a hand through his hair, trying to process the fact that he was having a conversation with an alien fox girl in his living room. It was surreal enough that part of him still expected to wake up and discover this was all some kind of weird dream. "Okay," he said, thinking out loud. "So you're from space. You're hurt. You're here, in my backyard, which means either you landed here on purpose or you crashed. Given the injury, I'm going to guess crashed." Kira's ears drooped slightly when he mentioned crashing, which Jake took as confirmation. "Right, so you crashed. That means you're probably stranded here, at least temporarily, which means you need somewhere to stay while you figure out how to get home, or contact your people, or whatever it is you need to do." Jake looked around his small living room, trying to imagine how this was going to work. He lived alone in a 2-bedroom house that he'd inherited from his grandmother. It wasn't fancy, but it was comfortable, and it definitely had enough space for a temporary house guest. "I guess you could stay here for a while," he said, then immediately wondered if he was making a terrible mistake. "I mean, if you want to. And if you're not, secretly planning to harvest my organs or take over my brain or anything like that." Kira tilted her head in that adorable way she had, clearly not understanding the specifics of what he'd said, but seeming to pick up on the general offer. She said something in her musical language that sounded like a question. "Stay," Jake said, gesturing around the room. "You can stay here. Sleep here." He pointed to the couch, then to himself and the direction of his bedroom. "I sleep there. You sleep here. Temporary. Until you figure out how to get home." Understanding dawned in Kira's amber eyes, and she looked genuinely surprised. She said something that sounded like another question, her tone uncertain. "Look," Jake said, "I know this is weird. Trust me, this is definitely the weirdest Tuesday I've ever had. But you're hurt, you're stranded, and you need help. I can't just leave you to figure out on your own. That would be, he searched for the right word. Wrong. It would be wrong. Kira stared at him for a long moment, and Jake had the distinct impression that she was trying to figure something out. Finally, she placed her hand over her heart again and said something that sounded solemn and important. I'm going to assume that was, yes. Thank you, Jake. You're not as horrible as my species probably told me humans would be, Jake said. Which, speaking of, what exactly did your people tell you about humans? Because I'm getting the feeling it might not have been entirely accurate. Kira's expression shifted to something that might have been embarrassment or confusion. She said something in her language that sounded like an explanation, but, of course, Jake couldn't understand a word of it. Right, language barrier again, Jake said. We really need to work on that. But, first, let me show you around the house, so you know where everything is. He spent the next hour giving Kira the grand tour of his modest home, explaining how everything worked. She was fascinated by his shower, amazed by his microwave, and absolutely mystified by his coffee maker. She seemed to understand that these were all technological devices, but the way they functioned was clearly completely alien to her. How exactly does your technology work where you come from? Jake asked as he watched her examine his toaster with the intensity of a scientist studying a new species. Because you act like you've never seen anything like this before, but you obviously have space travel, so your tech has to be more advanced than ours. Kira looked up from the toaster and said something in her musical language, then gestured in a way that might have been meant to indicate something flowing or organic. Organic technology? Jake guessed. Like living machines? Kira's ears perked up, and she nodded enthusiastically. She pointed to herself, then made a gesture that looked like something growing, then pointed to various appliances around the kitchen. So your technology is biological, and ours is mechanical, Jake said, beginning to understand. That would explain why you're so confused by everything. It's like, he thought for a moment, it's like if I suddenly found myself in a house where all the technology was made out of trained butterflies or something. Kira laughed at that, a sound like silver bells. It was the first genuinely happy sound she'd made since he'd found her, and Jake found himself smiling in response. We're going to be okay, he said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. This is crazy, and I have no idea what I'm doing, but we're going to figure it out. As if the universe had decided to test that optimism immediately, the lights in Jake's kitchen suddenly flickered and went out. A moment later, every electronic device in the house emitted a high-pitched whine and shut down simultaneously. Jake and Kira stood in the sudden darkness, listening to the ominous silence where the humming of various appliances had been just moments before. That's not normal, Jake said. Kira said something in her own language that sounded distinctly like cursing. Outside, Jake could hear car alarms going off throughout the neighborhood, and in the distance, the sound of what might have been emergency sirens. Kira, Jake said slowly, please tell me this isn't something you did. Kira's response was immediate and panicked, a rapid stream of musical words that Jake couldn't understand, but that definitely sounded like explanations and apologies. Okay, Jake said, trying to stay calm. Okay, so this is related to you being here. That's fine. We can deal with this. Through his kitchen window, Jake could see lights flickering on and off throughout the neighborhood as people try to figure out what had happened to their power. Mrs. Henderson was standing in her backyard with a flashlight, looking around in confusion. This was definitely going to be more complicated than just splitting the rent. As Jake watched his neighbors stumbling around in the dark, trying to understand why their entire world had just been turned upside down, he couldn't help but think that this was probably just the beginning. Whatever Kira was running from, wherever she'd come from, and however she'd ended up in his backyard, it was clear that her presence on Earth was going to have consequences. The question was whether those consequences would be limited to some electrical problems and confused neighbors, or whether they were all about to find themselves in the middle of something much bigger and more dangerous. Given the way his luck had been running lately, Jake was pretty sure he already knew the answer to that question. The power came back on 3 hours later, but by then, Jake's quiet life had been thoroughly and irrevocably shattered. It started with the phone calls. First, it was his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, asking if he'd experienced the strange electrical phenomenon and whether he thought it might be related to that meteor she'd seen crash in his backyard the night before. Jake assured her that everything was fine and that he hadn't seen any meteors, which was technically true since Kira had arrived via some kind of spacecraft rather than as a space rock. Then, it was his coworker Dave calling to complain about how the power outage had corrupted his World of Warcraft save file, and to ask if Jake wanted to grab beers and commiserate about their shared technological suffering. Jake begged off, claiming he wasn't feeling well, which was also technically true since discovering you're harboring an injured alien tends to make anyone feel a bit queasy. But the third call was different. It came at 2:47 a.m., waking Jake from an uneasy sleep on his living room floor. He'd given Kira his bed after discovering that her species apparently didn't sleep lying down, but instead curled up in small, den-like spaces. She'd taken one look at his king-size mattress and immediately claimed the space underneath it instead, which had led to a 20-minute game of charades as Jake tried to convince her that the bed was actually more comfortable than the floor. The voice on the other end of the phone was crisp, professional, and completely unfamiliar. "Mr. Morrison? This is Agent Sarah-chan with the Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs. We need to talk." Jake sat up slowly, instantly wide awake. "The Department of what now?" "Extraterrestrial Affairs. We're aware that you've had an unusual visitor recently, and we'd like to discuss the situation with you. Are you available for a conversation?" Jake glanced toward his bedroom, where he could see the faint glow of what he'd learned was Kira's natural bioluminescence seeping out from under the bed. "I think you might have a wrong number. I haven't had any visitors lately." "Mr. Morrison," Agent Shin said patiently, 3 hours ago, every electronic device within a quarter-mile radius of your house experienced simultaneous electromagnetic interference consistent with the presence of technology from the Vulpine Empire. We have satellite imagery of an unidentified craft entering Earth's atmosphere and disappearing from our sensors approximately 6 miles from your location. And according to our records, you called in sick to work today for the first time in 3 years, which suggests you're dealing with something unusual. Would you like to reconsider your answer?" Jake rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. "Okay, hypothetically speaking, if I were harboring an injured alien fox girl in my house, what exactly would this Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs want to do about it?" "That would depend on several factors," Agent Shin said. "Is the extraterrestrial in question injured?" "Hypothetically, yes." "Hostile?" "Definitely not." "Seeking asylum or attempting to return to their point of origin?" Jake paused, realizing he had no idea what Kira actually wanted. They'd spent the evening attempting to communicate through increasingly elaborate charades, but most of their progress had been limited to establishing basic needs like food, water, and the location of the bathroom. "I'm not sure. We're having some communication difficulties." "I see. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to be frank with you. Earth has been hosting extraterrestrial refugees for approximately 15 years now, but it's not something we advertise to the general public. The Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs exists to facilitate these situations in a way that protects both the refugees and human society. We're not the men in black, and we're not here to disappear anyone. We're essentially cosmic social workers." "Cosmic social workers," Jake repeated. "That's an oversimplification, but it's not inaccurate. What we'd like to do is send someone over to assess the situation and determine what kind of assistance both you and your guests might need. We can provide translation services, medical care, legal documentation, and help with eventual repatriation if desired." Jake looked toward his bedroom again, thinking about Kira's reaction when he'd offered to let her stay. The way her ears had drooped when he'd mentioned crashing, and the panicked explanation she'd given when the power had gone out. What if she doesn't want to go back? Then we help her apply for asylum and begin the integration process. "Mr. Morrison, I know this is a lot to take in, but you're not in trouble, and neither is your guest. We just want to help." 20 minutes later, Jake was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, waiting for a government agent to arrive and officially drag his life into the realm of science fiction. Kira was still asleep under his bed, curled up in a ball with her foxtail wrapped around herself like a blanket. Jake hadn't even realized she had a tail until he'd seen her sleeping, and the discovery had somehow made the entire situation feel even more surreal. Agent Sarah-chan turned out to be a small, efficient-looking woman in her 30s wearing a plain black suit and carrying a briefcase that looked like it cost more than Jake's car. She introduced herself with a firm handshake and immediately set about making Jake feel like he was the least competent person in the room. "Have you provided any medical assistance?" she asked, pulling out a tablet and stylus. "I cleaned the wound and bandaged it," Jake said. "It seemed to help." "Good. Any attempts at communication beyond basic gestures?" "We've established names and a few basic concepts. She understands that this is my house and that she's welcome to stay." Agent Shin made notes on her tablet. "Any indication of what brought her here or what she might be fleeing from?" "She seemed upset when I mentioned crashing, and she definitely panicked when the power went out. I think her arrival might have caused that electromagnetic thing you mentioned." "Most likely. Volpine technology is heavily biointegrated, and it tends to interfere with our electronics when it's damaged or malfunctioning." Agent Shin looked up from her tablet. "Has she exhibited any unusual behaviors or abilities?" Jake thought about the way Kira's hand had felt when she'd touched his, the strange tingling sensation, and the way her eyes had widened in surprise. "There was this thing when we touched hands, like a static shock but different." Agent Shin's eyebrows rose slightly. "Interesting. The Volpines are an empathic species. It's possible she was attempting to establish a psychic connection with you." "What now?" "Psychic connection. Emotional resonance, shared feelings, that sort of thing. It's how they typically communicate with species that don't speak their language." Jake stared at her. "Are you telling me she was trying to read my mind?" "More like she was trying to feel what you were feeling. It's not mind reading exactly. Think of it as emotional Wi-Fi." Before Jake could fully process this information, there was a soft thudding sound from his bedroom, followed by what sounded like Kira's voice calling out in distress. "That would be your guest waking up," Agent Shin said. "Volpines don't handle sleep transitions well when they're injured." Jake was already moving toward the bedroom. "Kira? It's okay, I'm here." He found her sitting on the floor beside his bed, looking disoriented and frightened. When she saw him, she immediately started speaking rapidly in her musical language, gesturing toward the living room where Agent Shun was waiting. "It's okay," Jake said, kneeling down beside her. "There's someone here to help us. She can translate for us so we can actually talk to each other." Kira's ears perked up at the word translate, and she looked toward the living room with interest rather than fear. "That's right," Jake said. "We can finally have a real conversation." When Jake led Kira into the living room, Agent Shun was already setting up what looked like a small, crystalline device on the coffee table. The device hummed softly and began to emit a gentle blue glow. "This is a universal translator," Agent Shun explained to Jake. "It works by analyzing brainwave patterns and converting them into understandable language. It's not perfect, but it should allow for basic communication." Kira approached the device cautiously, her fox ears twitching with curiosity. When Agent Shun gestured for her to sit down, she perched on the edge of the couch like she was ready to bolt at any moment. Agent Shun activated the device, and suddenly, Kira's musical language became understandable words. "Is this real?" Kira's voice came through the translator, sounding amazed. "I can understand you both now." "Yes," Agent Shun said, her own voice taking on a slightly mechanical quality as the translator processed it into Volpine. "This device allows us to communicate directly. I'm Agent Shun with Earth's Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs. I understand you've been staying with Mr. Morrison." Kira looked back and forth between Jake and Agent Shun, her amber eyes wide. "Jake has been very kind. I crashed here yesterday, and he helped me even though he had no obligation to do so. His behavior has been most confusing." "Confusing how?" Agent Shun asked. "According to our intelligence reports, humans are supposed to be territorial, aggressive, and suspicious of outsiders. But Jake found me injured in his territory, and instead of driving me away or demanding payment for assistance, he offered me food and shelter without asking for anything in return. This does not match any of the behavioral patterns we were taught to expect." Agent Shin shot Jake a look that might have been amused. "I see. What exactly were you told about human behavior?" "That humans are ruled by strict hierarchical structures and complex social protocols," Kira said. "That they hoard resources and form aggressive territorial groups. That they are suspicious of anyone different and quick to resort to violence when threatened." Jake felt his eyebrows climbing toward his hairline. "Who told you that?" "The Galactic Council's intelligence briefings," Kira said. Every species receives detailed behavioral analyses before making contact with new civilizations. Humans are classified as a Category 7 species. What does that mean? Jake asked. Agent Shin answered before Kira could respond. Category 7 species are considered unpredictable and potentially dangerous. They're typically subject to strict contact protocols and limited interaction. But that's ridiculous, Jake said. I mean, okay, we're not perfect, but we're not some kind of savage species that can't be trusted. That's what I'm beginning to understand, Kira said, her ears drooping slightly. Everything I was taught about humans appears to be incomplete. Agent Shin made more notes on her tablet. What brings you to Earth, Kira? Are you here on official business? Kira's expression darkened, and her tail curled around her feet. I'm a refugee. I was part of a diplomatic mission to negotiate a trade agreement with the Crystalline Collective, but our ship was attacked by Void Hunters. I was the only survivor. Void Hunters, Agent Shin repeated, her tone sharpening. How long ago was this attack? 3 standard cycles ago. I've been hiding in the Outer Rim systems ever since, trying to find a safe place to contact my government. And you chose Earth because? Kira looked embarrassed. I didn't choose Earth. My escape pod's navigation system was damaged. I was aiming for the Centauri trade station, but the pod malfunctioned and brought me here instead. So you ended up here by accident, Jake said. Yes. And according to everything I've been told, landing on a human world should have meant capture, interrogation, and probable death. Instead, I woke up with my wounds cleaned and bandaged in the home of a human who seems determined to help me despite having no reason to do so. Agent Shun and Jake exchanged glances. Kira, Agent Shun said carefully, what do you know about the Galactic Council's current stance on human membership? Kira's ears pricked up. Membership? Humans aren't members of the Galactic Council. No, we're not, Agent Shun agreed. But we've been trying to join for about 20 years now. Our application keeps getting rejected. I was not aware humans had applied for membership, Kira said slowly. Let me guess, Jake said. The Council's official reason for rejecting us is that we're too unpredictable and aggressive to be trusted with galactic citizenship. Among other things, yes, Agent Shin confirmed. The official rejections cite our chaotic social structures, our inability to follow established protocols, and our dangerous tendency toward individualistic behavior. Jake looked at Kira, who was beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable. Is that what your people really think of us? That we're just a bunch of violent barbarians? Not violent, Kira said quietly, but unpredictable, yes. The reports say that humans are impossible to negotiate with because you don't follow standard diplomatic protocols, that your societies are chaotic and your behavior patterns are erratic, that you make decisions based on emotion rather than logic. And what do you think now? Jake asked. Kira was quiet for a long moment, her amber eyes studying Jake's face. I think, she said finally, that the reports may have misunderstood what those traits actually mean. Agent Shun leaned forward. Explain. Jake didn't help me because of diplomatic protocol or social obligation, Kira said. He helped me because he saw someone who was hurt and decided that was reason enough to act. When I offered formal thanks according to Vulpine custom, he didn't understand the gesture, but he accepted it graciously anyway. When his technology failed, he didn't panic or blame me, even though I was clearly the cause. He just adapted. She paused, her fox ears twitching thoughtfully. The reports describe human unpredictability as a weakness, but I'm beginning to think it might actually be a strength. You don't follow established protocols because you're constantly creating new ones as circumstances require. You don't have rigid social hierarchies because you value individual contribution over prescribed roles. That's a very diplomatic way of saying we make it up as we go along, Jake said. But that's exactly what makes you effective, Kira said, her voice growing more animated. When I crashed here, any other species would have followed their standard first contact procedures. They would have reported to their authorities, initiated formal protocols, and waited for official guidance. By the time help arrived, I might have died from my injuries. But Jake saw someone who needed help and helped immediately, Agent Shin said, understanding where this was going. Exactly. And now I'm beginning to wonder how many other things the Council might have misunderstood about human nature. Agent Shin made more notes, her expression thoughtful. Kira, would you be willing to testify about your experiences here? To provide an alternative perspective on human behavior for the Council's records. Kira's ears perked up with interest. You think it might help with your membership application? It couldn't hurt, Agent Shin said, especially coming from a Vulpine diplomat. Your species is highly respected in Council circles. I will be honored to speak on humanity's behalf, Kira said. But first, I need to contact my government and report the Void Hunter attack. My people need to know what happened to the diplomatic mission. We can help with that, Agent Shin said. In fact, we've been trying to establish formal communication with the Vulpine Empire for years. Having you here might finally give us the excuse we need to open diplomatic channels. Jake listened to this conversation with growing amazement. In a span of 12 hours, he'd gone from a quiet life in suburban Ohio to being inadvertently involved in interstellar diplomacy. It was the kind of thing that should have been terrifying, but somehow, sitting here with Kira and Agent Shun, it just felt right. Maybe Kira was onto something about human adaptability. So what happens now? Jake asked. Now, Agent Shun said, we contact the Vulpine Empire, arrange for Kira to make her report, and see if we can turn an accidental first contact into a diplomatic opportunity. And in the meantime, Kira asked. Agent Shin looked at Jake. That depends on Mr. Morrison. Are you willing to continue hosting a refugee while we work out the diplomatic details? The department can provide compensation and support, of course. Jake looked at Kira, who was watching him with those extraordinary amber eyes. 3 days ago, the most complicated thing in his life had been deciding what to have for dinner. Now he was being asked to continue housing an alien diplomat while Earth tried to join the galactic community. It should have been an easy decision to pass the responsibility to the professionals. Agent Shin seemed competent, and the Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs clearly had resources and experience Jake lacked. But when he looked at Kira, he remembered the way she'd looked when she first woke up in his backyard, frightened and alone and hurt. He thought about how carefully she'd examined every mundane object in his house, approaching each new discovery with curiosity instead of fear. He thought about the way she'd laughed when he'd made that joke about butterfly technology. Yeah, Jake said. Yeah, she can stay as long as she needs to. Kira's entire face lit up with a smile that made Jake's chest feel warm. Thank you, Jake. I promise I will try not to cause any more electrical problems. We'll work on that, Agent Shin said, packing up her translator. I'll be in touch in a few days with an update on the diplomatic situation. In the meantime, try to keep a low profile. The last thing we need is news crews camping out in your front yard. After Agent Shin left, Jake and Kira sat in comfortable silence, both of them processing the morning's revelations. So, Jake said eventually, it turns out I'm accidentally participating in humanity's bid for galactic citizenship. And I'm accidentally discovering that everything my people know about humans might be wrong, Kira replied. Think we can figure it out as we go? Kira's fox ears perked up, and she gave him another one of those brilliant smiles. I'm beginning to think that making it up as we go along might be exactly what this situation requires. Outside, Jake could hear the normal sounds of his suburban neighborhood going about its business, completely unaware that the fate of humanity's place in the galaxy was being decided in a modest 2-bedroom house over coffee and leftover pizza. If the rest of the galaxy thought humans were unpredictable, Jake mused they were about to find out just how right they were. Living with an alien fox girl, as it turned out, was significantly more complicated than Jake had initially anticipated. The first major crisis occurred on day 3, when Jake returned from grocery run to find Kira standing in his kitchen, surrounded by what appeared to be the dismantled remains of every electronic appliance he owned. His microwave was in pieces on the counter, his coffee maker had been reduced to its component parts, and his toaster looked like it had been surgically dissected by someone with an extremely precise understanding of electrical engineering. What happened here? Jake asked, setting down his grocery bags and surveying the devastation. Kira looked up from where she was delicately examining his coffee maker's heating element, her amber eyes bright with excitement. I was trying to understand how your technology functions, she said through the portable translator Agent Shin had left with them. It's fascinating. These devices are so inefficient compared to biotech, but the engineering principles are remarkably clever. Right, Jake said slowly, and you had to take everything apart to figure that out. I was trying to modify them to be more compatible with my biofield, Kira explained, as if this were perfectly reasonable. The electromagnetic interference I generate is causing problems, so I thought if I could integrate some organic components. She gestured toward what had once been his microwave, and Jake noticed for the first time that there were thin, silvery threads running between the components. They pulsed with a soft light that matched the bioluminescence he'd noticed when Kira slept. Are those alive? Jake asked. Bioconductive filaments, Kira said proudly. They'll allow your devices to function normally despite my electromagnetic field. I grew them myself. Jake stared at the silvery threads for a long moment, trying to process the fact that Kira had apparently grown some kind of living technology in his kitchen. You could just grow electronic components? Of course. Can't you? Kira asked, then immediately looked embarrassed. Sorry, I keep forgetting that humans use mechanical technology. This must seem very strange to you. A little bit, Jake admitted, but also kind of amazing. Will they actually work? By way of demonstration, Kira activated what had once been his coffee maker. The biofilaments pulsed brighter, and the machine hummed to life, beginning to brew a pot of coffee despite being completely disassembled on the counter. That's impossible, Jake said, staring at the floating coffee filter and the heating element that was somehow functioning without being connected to anything else. Not impossible, Kira corrected, just different. Biotech doesn't require physical connections the way mechanical tech does. The filaments create quantum-entangled pathways that allow energy and information to flow between components. Jake watched steam rise from the coffee pot, which was hovering 3 inches above the counter. I feel like I should be more freaked out by this. Why aren't you? Kira asked curiously. Jake considered this question seriously. I think because you're so excited about it, he said finally. You're not trying to be mysterious or scary. You're just sharing something you're passionate about. It's like if my neighbor came over to show me his model train setup, except instead of trains, it's impossible alien technology. Kira's ears perked up with delight. You truly don't find this threatening? Should I? According to our cultural briefings, humans react to displays of superior technology with fear and aggression. It's supposed to trigger your territorial instincts and make you perceive the technology user as a threat to your dominance hierarchy. Jake laughed. Kira, I work in IT support. My entire job is dealing with technology that's smarter than me and makes me feel incompetent. If I felt threatened every time I encountered superior tech, I'd never leave the house. But this is alien technology, Kira pointed out. Doesn't that make it different? Well, but you're the one using it and you're... Jake paused, trying to find the right words. You're not scary. You're curious and kind, and you get excited about coffee makers. The fact that you can do impossible things with living technology doesn't change that you're still the person who spent 20 minutes yesterday trying to figure out how mic opener works. Kira ducked her head, her silver hair falling forward to hide her face. You really think I'm kind? Of course, Jake said, surprised by the question. Why wouldn't I? Because I've been deceiving you, Kira said quietly. There are things about my situation that I haven't told you. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of things? Kira was quiet for a long moment, her fox ears drooping with what looked like shame. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I'm not just a refugee, she said. I'm also a criminal. Jake sat down heavily on one of his kitchen chairs, suddenly grateful that they were still in their original, non-floating configuration. Okay, what kind of criminal? According to Vulpine law, I committed treason against the Empire, Kira said, still not meeting his eyes. The diplomatic mission I was part of, I wasn't just there as a translator. I was there to steal classified information from the Crystalline Collective. What kind of information? Military intelligence. Specifically, information about human defensive capabilities. Jake felt the world tilt sideways. What? The Vulpine Empire has been considering whether to support humanity's application to join the Galactic Council. Kira explained, her words coming faster now, as if she were afraid she'd lose her nerve if she didn't get them all out at once. But there's a faction within our government that believes humans are too dangerous to be allowed into the galactic community. They wanted intelligence about your military technology so they could present evidence to the Council the humans pose a threat to galactic security. And you were supposed to gather this intelligence. Yes, but when I learned more about the plan, I realized it was based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about human nature. The faction pushing for this intelligence-gathering operation believes that humans are naturally aggressive and expansionist, and that given access to galactic technology, you would inevitably become a conquering force. Jake rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. So what did you do? I sabotaged the mission, Kira said simply. I destroyed the intelligence we had gathered and transmitted a warning to the Crystalline Collective about the Void Hunter attack route our ship was taking. That's how the Void Hunters knew where to find us. You betrayed your own people to protect humanity? I betrayed a corrupt faction within my government to prevent them from manipulating the Council based on false information, Kira corrected. But, yes, technically, that makes me a traitor under Vulpine law. Jake stared at her for a long moment, trying to process this information. Why are you telling me this now? Because Agent Chun is going to contact my government soon, and when she does, there's a good chance they'll demand my immediate extradition to face treason charges, Kira said. I didn't want you to learn about this from someone else. What happens if you're extradited? Kira's ears flattened against her head. Exile at best. Execution at worst. For trying to prevent a war, for disobeying direct orders, and causing the death of my fellow diplomats, Kira said. From their perspective, I'm responsible for the Void Hunter attack that killed my team. Jake stood up abruptly and began pacing around his kitchen, trying to think. Okay, this is definitely more complicated than I thought. But it doesn't change anything. What do you mean? I mean you're still welcome here, Jake said firmly. I don't care what your government thinks you did wrong. You made a choice to protect people you'd never met because you thought it was the right thing to do. That doesn't make you a criminal in my book. Kira stared at him with her mouth slightly open. Jake, you don't understand. If my government demands my extradition, your Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs will have no choice but to comply. Refusing would cause a diplomatic incident that could destroy any chance of humans joining the Galactic Council. Then, we'll figure out another solution, Jake said. What other solution could there be? Jake stopped pacing and looked at her directly. I don't know yet, but there has to be something. Maybe we can prove that the faction you opposed was planning something illegal. Maybe we can get other species to speak up about your actions. Maybe we can find a way to expose the real conspiracy. And if we can't, then we'll deal with that when it happens, Jake said. But I'm not going to just hand you over to be executed for doing the right thing. Kira's eyes filled with tears, which surprised Jake since he hadn't known that Vulpines could cry. Why, she asked. Why would you risk so much for someone you barely know? Jake considered this question, then sat back down across from her. Can I tell you something about human nature that your intelligence reports probably got wrong? Kira nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. We have this weird habit of deciding that someone is part of our pack, and once we've decided that, we'll do pretty much anything to protect them, Jake said. It doesn't matter if we've known them for years or for days. It doesn't matter if protecting them is logical or practical or safe. Once you're part of the pack, you're family. And you decided I'm part of your pack. Kira, you spent the last 3 days learning how to use my coffee maker, trying to figure out why I keep the bathroom door closed, and accidentally turning my kitchen into a science fiction movie. You've been worried about causing me problems with the electrical interference. You've been grateful for every small kindness. And you've been genuinely interested in everything from my terrible cooking to my collection of action movies. Plus, you just confessed to committing treason against your own government because you thought it was wrong to start a war based on lies. Jake reached across the table and took her hand, ignoring the familiar tingle of their bioelectric connection. Yeah, you're definitely part of the pack. Kira squeezed his hand, her amber eyes bright with emotion. In Vulpine culture, we have a saying, the fox who finds a true friend has found a treasure greater than all the stars in the sky. That's beautiful, Jake said. It means, Kira said, smiling through her tears, that I've been incredibly lucky to crash land in your tomato garden. Their moment was interrupted by Jake's phone ringing. The caller ID showed Agent Chen's number. That's probably not good timing, Jake said, but he answered anyway. Hello. Mr. Morrison, we have a problem, Agent Chen said without preamble. I just received word from the Vulpine Empire. They're sending a ship to retrieve Kira. Jake looked at Kira, who had gone very still. When? They'll be here in 2 days. And, Jake, they're not coming just for Kira. They're sending a full diplomatic mission with authority to negotiate humanity's council membership application. That sounds like good news, Jake said cautiously. It would be, except that according to our intelligence sources, the mission is being led by the same faction that Kira was working against. If they're coming here, it means they have a plan, and I'm betting it's not going to be good for either Kira or humanity's chances of joining the Council. Jake closed his eyes. How bad are we talking? Potentially war-ending bad, Agent Chen said. If this faction can prove that harboring Kira makes humans an unreliable galactic partner, they can not only block our Council membership, but potentially justify military action against Earth as a rogue planet. So what do we do? I'm working on it, Agent Chen said. But in the meantime, you and Kira need to stay put and stay out of sight. If the Vulpine delegation discovers she's been living openly with a human civilian, it'll play right into their narrative about human unpredictability and poor judgment. Jake looked around his kitchen, with its floating coffee maker and bioluminescent filaments connecting the pieces of his dismantled appliances. Agent Chen, what exactly counts as staying out of sight? Why? What have you two been up to? Well, Jake said, watching steam continue to rise from the hovering coffee pot. Let's just say that if anyone comes looking for signs of alien technology integration, they're going to find some pretty compelling evidence. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Morrison, please tell me you haven't been letting Kira experiment with human technology. Jake looked at Kira, who was now examining his floating coffee pot with obvious pride in her work. I'm going to hang up now and pretend you never asked me that question. Jake, wait. He ended the call and looked at Kira. So, hypothetically speaking, how quickly could you put all my appliances back together the way they were? Kira's ears drooped. The biointegration is permanent. Once the filaments bond with the mechanical components, they can't be separated without destroying both technologies. Right, Jake said. So we have 2 days to figure out how to hide a kitchen full of impossible alien technology from a diplomatic delegation that's specifically looking for evidence that humans can't be trusted with alien technology. I'm sorry, Kira said quietly. I should have asked before modifying your belongings. Jake looked at her serious expression, then at his floating coffee maker, then back at her. Despite everything, he found himself starting to laugh. What's funny? Kira asked, confused. I was just thinking, Jake said, that if the Galactic Council really wants to understand human nature, they should probably know that most of us would consider having a kitchen full of impossible alien technology to be pretty much the coolest thing that could ever happen to us. Kira's ears perked up. Really, Kira, my coffee maker is floating, and my toaster is held together by what looks like living lightning. This is every science fiction fan's dream come true. But we still need to hide it from the delegation. Yeah, Jake agreed. We definitely need to figure that part out. He looked around his transformed kitchen, trying to think of a solution. The biofilaments were beautiful, pulsing with soft light as they maintained the quantum connections between his dismantled appliances. But they were also completely impossible to explain as anything other than advanced alien technology. What if we don't hide it? Jake said suddenly. What? What if instead of trying to conceal the evidence of alien-human integration, we use it to prove your point about human adaptability? Kira stared at him. I don't understand. You said that the faction opposing humanity believes we're too dangerous and unpredictable to be trusted with galactic technology, right? But look at what actually happened when you shared your technology with me. I didn't try to weaponize it or steal it or use it to gain power over anyone. I thought it was amazing, and I was grateful that you trusted me enough to show me. But that's just you, Kira protested. One human's reaction doesn't prove anything about your species as a whole. Maybe not, Jake admitted, but it's a start. And maybe if we can get the right people to see this, we can start changing some minds about what humans are really like. Kira was quiet for a long moment, her amber eyes thoughtful. It's a significant risk, she said finally. If the delegation interprets this as evidence that humans are attempting to steal Vulpine technology, then we make sure they don't, Jake said. We control the narrative. We show them that this wasn't theft or coercion, but cooperation between two people who trusted each other enough to share knowledge. And if it doesn't work? Jake squeezed her hand. Then at least we'll have tried something instead of just hiding and hoping for the best. Kira looked around the kitchen, taking in the floating coffee maker, the dismantled appliances, and the beautiful biofilaments that connected them all together. You know, she said slowly, there might be a way to make this work. What do you mean? Kira's fox ears perked up with sudden excitement. What if we don't just show them the technology integration? What if we show them how it happened? The process, the collaboration, the trust that made it possible. Jake felt a spark of hope. You mean document it? Show them that this was a partnership, not an appropriation. Exactly. And more than that, Kira's eyes were bright with possibility. What if we show them that the integration works both ways? That you've taught me as much about human technology as I've shown you about Vulpine biotech. Jake looked around his kitchen with new eyes, seeing not just evidence of alien technology, but proof of what could happen when two very different species decided to trust each other. You know what? He said. I think we might actually have a shot at this. Outside, the sun was setting over suburban Ohio, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. In 2 days, representatives of an interstellar government would arrive to determine not just Kira's fate, but potentially the future of humanity's place in the galaxy. But for now, Jake and Kira sat in a kitchen full of impossible technology, planning to prove that sometimes the most unpredictable thing about humans was their capacity for hope. The Vulpine delegation arrived exactly when Agent Chun had predicted, but not in any way Jake had expected. He'd been imagining something dramatic and science-fictional. Massive ships descending from the sky, formal ceremonies, perhaps even a red carpet. Instead, he was awakened at 6:30 a.m. by what sounded like his neighbor Mrs. Henderson arguing with someone in her front yard. I don't care if you're from the government, Mrs. Henderson was saying loudly enough to be heard through Jake's bedroom window. You people have been driving through my neighborhood at all hours, parking those ridiculous black cars everywhere. And now I want to set up some kind of a diplomatic tent thing in the middle of my street? I don't think so. Jake rolled out of bed and peered through his curtains to see Mrs. Henderson facing off against Agent Chun and 2 other people in dark suits. Behind them, a small crowd of equally official-looking individuals was attempting to erect what appeared to be a white pavilion in the middle of Maple Street. This is supposed to be subtle, Jake muttered. The Vulpine ship is cloaked and hovering approximately 100 feet above us, Kira said from her sleeping spot under the bed. The delegation doesn't want to risk a public landing, so they're using your front yard as a neutral meeting ground. My front yard? Well, technically the street in front of your house, Kira amended, which I believe Mrs. Henderson considers part of her territory. Jake pulled on clothes and headed outside to see if he could help defuse the situation. As he approached the group, Agent Shin spotted him and waved him over. Mr. Morrison, perfect timing. Could you please explain to Mrs. Henderson that this is a matter of national security? Oh, it's national security now, Mrs. Henderson said, turning her glare on Jake. Jake, honey, what kind of trouble have you gotten yourself into? First there were those electrical problems, then all these government people started showing up, and now they want to turn our street into some kind of, what did you call it? Diplomatic venue. Jake looked at the pavilion, which was rapidly taking shape despite Mrs. Henderson's protests. It was larger than he'd expected, with elegant white walls and what appeared to be some kind of technological equipment being installed along the perimeter. Mrs. Henderson, he said diplomatically, I promise this is temporary, and these people are here to help with a cultural exchange program I've been participating in. Cultural exchange, Mrs. Henderson repeated skeptically. What kind of cultural exchange requires tents in the middle of the street? Before Jake could come up with an answer, the air above them began to shimmer, and suddenly, a group of figures materialized on the street as if they'd been beamed down from nowhere. Mrs. Henderson took one look at the newcomers and sat down heavily on her front steps. Well, she said faintly, I suppose that explains the tent. The Vulpine delegation consisted of 5 individuals, all of whom shared Kira's fox-like ears and silver hair, but who carried themselves with a formal dignity that made Kira seem almost casual by comparison. They wore flowing robes that shifted color in the sunlight, and when they moved, Jake could see the faint shimmer of the same bioluminescence he'd noticed in Kira. The leader of the delegation was a tall, stern-looking woman with elaborate braided hair and amber eyes that seemed to miss nothing. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the street, despite the fact that she wasn't speaking particularly loudly. I am Ambassador Lyra of the Vulpine Empire, she announced. I seek audience with the human Jake Morrison and the fugitive Kira who has been harbored here. Agent Shin stepped forward. Ambassador, welcome to Earth. I'm Agent Chun with the Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs. We're honored to host this diplomatic meeting. Ambassador Lyra's gaze swept over Agent Chin dismissively before settling on Jake. "You are Jake Morrison?" "Yes, ma'am," Jake said, trying not to feel intimidated. "You have been harboring a wanted criminal of the Volpine Empire for 6 days." "I've been providing assistance to someone who needed help," Jake corrected. Ambassador Lyra's ears twitched, which Jake was beginning to recognize as a sign of irritation. "Kira is accused of treason, sabotage, and causing the deaths of fellow citizens. These are serious crimes under Volpine law. And under human law, providing aid to someone in need is considered a moral obligation," Jake replied. "Even when that person is a criminal?" Jake thought about everything Kira had told him about the conspiracy she'd uncovered, about the faction that wanted to prevent humanity from joining the Galactic Council, about her choice to protect people she'd never met rather than follow orders she knew were wrong. "Especially then," he said firmly. Ambassador Lyra studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward the pavilion. "We will discuss this matter in private. Bring the fugitive." Jake looked back toward his house, where Kira was standing in the doorway. Even from a distance, he could see that she was nervous, her fox ears flattened against her head, and her tail curled tightly around her waist. "Kira," he called. "It's okay. Come on out." Kira approached slowly, her amber eyes fixed on Ambassador Lyra. When she reached the group, she performed a formal bow that looked both graceful and deeply respectful. "Ambassador," she said, "I am prepared to answer for my actions." "You will indeed," Ambassador Lyra said coldly. Inside. Now, the pavilion's interior was larger than it had appeared from outside, and Jake suspected some kind of spatial manipulation technology was involved. The walls were lined with what looked like living tapestries that shifted and flowed with patterns of light, and the air hummed with the soft sound of alien technology. Ambassador Lyra took a seat behind what appeared to be a desk grown from the same biotechnology Kira had used in Jake's kitchen, while the other delegation members arranged themselves around the perimeter of the space. Agent Shun and Jake were directed to chairs across from the ambassador, and Kira was left standing in the center of the room like a defendant awaiting judgment. "Let us begin with the charges," Ambassador Lyra said. "Kira of the Silver Wind Clan, you are accused of betraying your oath to the Volpine Empire, destroying classified intelligence, and providing aid to enemies of the state, resulting in the deaths of Ambassador Fennec, Scientist Vixen, and Guard Captain Reynard. How do you answer these charges?" "I accept responsibility for my actions," Kira said quietly. "But I do not accept that those actions constitute crimes." Ambassador Lyra's ears flattened. "Explain." "The intelligence mission I was assigned was based on false premises and would have led to an unjust war," Kira said, her voice growing stronger. "I chose to prevent that war, even at the cost of my own life and freedom. That was not your decision to make. With respect, Ambassador, when faced with a choice between following orders and preventing genocide, I believe any moral being has an obligation to choose prevention." "Genocide?" Agent Chen interjected sharply. "Ambassador Lyra, what exactly was this intelligence mission intended to accomplish?" Ambassador Lyra's expression remained carefully neutral. "That information is classified." "Actually," Kira said, "it's not. Not anymore." She reached into the folds of her clothing and produced what looked like a small, crystalline device. The crystal pulsed with soft light, and suddenly, the air in the pavilion filled with images. Jake watched in amazement as three-dimensional scenes played out around them. Star charts showing human-controlled space, technical readouts of Earth's defensive capabilities, and what appear to be military planning sessions involving Volpine officials. "This is a complete recording of the intelligence gathering operation," Kira announced, including conversations between the mission leaders discussing their true objectives. One of the holographic scenes focused on a meeting between several Volpines in formal military attire. Jake couldn't understand their language, but the universal translator was still active, and he listened with growing horror as their words became clear. "The humans must not be allowed to join the council," one of the figures was saying. "Their unpredictable nature makes them too dangerous to be trusted with galactic technology. The intelligence we gather will prove their aggressive tendencies," another replied. "Once the Council sees evidence of their military capabilities and expansionist policies, they'll agree that humanity poses a threat to galactic peace." And if the intelligence doesn't support our conclusions, a third voice asked. Then we'll modify it until it does, the first speaker said coldly. The security of the galaxy is more important than the accuracy of our reports. The hologram faded, leaving the pavilion in stunned silence. Ambassador Lyra's face had gone pale, and her ears were flattened completely against her head. Where did you obtain this recording? I made it myself during the mission briefings, Kira said. I became suspicious when our orders kept changing, and when I discovered what the true objective was, I decided to document it. You had no authority to— I had every authority, Kira interrupted, her voice ringing with conviction. Article 7 of the Galactic Peace Accords specifically states that any citizen of a member species has not only the right but the obligation to report evidence of war crimes or conspiracy to commit genocide. Agent Chan was typing rapidly on her tablet. She's right, she said. Article 7 supersedes all national and species-specific laws when it comes to preventing galactic war crimes. The conspiracy to fabricate evidence against humanity qualifies as preparation for genocide, Kira continued. If successful, it would have led to the Council authorizing military action against Earth, resulting in the deaths of billions of innocent beings. Ambassador Lyra stared at Kira for a long moment, then turned to one of the other delegation members. Counselor Sage, what is your legal opinion on this matter? Counselor Sage, a smaller vulpine with white-tipped ears and an elderly demeanor, cleared his throat nervously. Technically, if the recordings are authentic, Kira's actions would be protected under Article 7. However, the accusations she's making against high-ranking Empire officials are extremely serious. They're also completely accurate, Kira said. She activated her crystal device again, and new holograms filled the space. These recordings show the same officials discussing plans to manipulate other species governments, to falsify intelligence reports, and to use their positions within the Council to orchestrate conflicts that would benefit the Vulpine Empire economically. Jake watched the new holograms with growing amazement and outrage. The conspiracy wasn't just about humanity. It was about several species that had applied for Council membership, all of whom had been systematically undermined by falsified intelligence reports and manufactured crises. My God, Agent Chen breathed. This isn't just about human membership. This is about controlling who gets to join the galactic community, and ensuring that the Vulpine Empire remains one of the most influential voices in that community, Kira added. The